You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
So last night it was the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics, and a more moist opening ceremony I've yet to see. You and I were WhatsApping about it during it. I got one question to ask you. Does anything need to be 4 hours long, Mark?
No.
4 hours long?
Especially in the rain. I mean, what mortified me was I woke up this morning seeing how many newspapers would have used my headline. Because I thought my headline was quite good that I sent you. The Eiffel Shower.
Absolutely.
Because
it writes itself, doesn't it?
It writes itself, because I was saying to you last night, there will not be one single review of this event that doesn't mention the rain in the first sentence. And they all did, because you kind of had to, That's the risk. Everything that happens outdoors is dependent on one thing and one thing only: the weather.
If the weather's fine,
your theory about Live Aid. Live Aid would not have been a success if it had poured with rain. And it's true. And that thing last night only started to work when it got dark, because it wasn't a particularly spectacular show. It was just they had the confidence that it would work because the backdrop is the most glorious city in the world. But when you can't see the most glorious city in the world because it's absolutely shanking down, it only really worked when it was pitch dark.
I was sitting on my sofa, realizing how many words we British have for raining hard, you know what I mean? It was, you just said shanking down. I've never heard that one. Yeah. The one my mother always used to use was "it's siling down." Absolutely siling down. The thing that struck me as most apposite last night was it was hammering down. When you occasionally got certain camera angles, you could see it just bouncing off people. It was clearly coming down.
Well, there was a guy playing a grand piano. I don't know if you saw that, but he's on a barge somewhere, on a boat or something. And the sound of the rain pelting down onto the piano lid, picked up by his mic, was so loud you really couldn't barely hear him playing. I just thought, this is ludicrous. And then you got a shot of Keir Starmer, of course, wearing his anorak, which is great.
Keir Starmer
would not wear the Pacamac. He's typically British. He's come prepared. Yes. He's probably got 3 or 4 different changes of waterproof clothes. He's probably got waterproof trousers on.
He's got sandwiches. He's got a copy of the Daily Sketch. He's got a crossword to do in case it gets slow. No, I thought that was really good. There's a sea of people.
I've got one question I want to ask, right?
Go on.
And that's the big hit that they played at the end, which I guess is one of France's biggest hits, is Supernature. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's Mark Cerrone, isn't it? I think it's Cerrone.
I think so, yeah.
And the moment I heard that, I thought, this is nicked from the Days of Pearly Spencer by David McWilliams. That did there's a little keyboard riff at the beginning, which is played by the string section on the Days of Pearly Spencer, covered also by Mark Armand at one stage. So I want anybody listening to let us know if they think we're right, because I think it's a wholesale steal.
It was a huge hit, wasn't it? See, it sold 8 million records at the time whenever it came out. Earlier in the 80s, I suppose. And the lyrics were written by Lena Lovitch.
I know.
So presumably there's a big fat envelope coming.
I would imagine that once a month there's a huge thud through her letterbox.
More power
out laughing. Think back to that 10 minutes work she did in 1977. It's good.
But the one thing about it all, the abiding impression of the whole thing, the rain and the kind of mad fashion aside and so forth, it's just the extraordinary determination to enjoy it on the part of the athletes. These boatloads of young people going past, coming from all corners of the earth, just smiling and waving through all this. I thought that was quite cheering, actually.
Oh, it's lovely. Why would they let that dent their one moment of glory?
Oh, absolutely. You wouldn't.
Because that's the bit you're going to enjoy, is the bit when you arrive. Because it's the bit when you go is the worry. Have you acquitted yourself with glory, or did you fall literally at the first hurdle? So at least no one's done anything wrong. They haven't damaged their reputation. I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to all of it.
Yeah. Okay. So. The sad note we have to strike this week is the death of John Mayall. After what must be regarded as a pretty good innings, 90 years old.
90 years old.
90 years old. So I was just doing a bit of checking on this. So he was born in November 1933, Mark, which is the year, but bear with me, that Hitler came to power in Germany. It was the year when George V was still on the throne of this country. Okay. And in the United States, prohibition had not yet been repealed. So he's born in the era of Al Capone and the bootleggers and Elliot Ness and all that kind of thing, which is a really, I can't think of another kind of what you might call a rock star who goes back that far.
Yeah, that's one of the first things I registered about him, because he's 20 years older than me. And I remember thinking how old John Mayall was. You know, as I say, born in 1933, he did national service.
Did national 4 years.
I think in Korea, actually.
Yeah,
like Bill Wyman. There aren't many rock musicians who did national service. He was 10 years older than, most of the Beatles and the Stones. 12 years older than Eric Clapton. It's really interesting. So Eric Clapton, when he talks to that very emotional video, which I'm sure anyone listening has probably seen, actually, when he talks about him as being his surrogate dad, because Clapton had that complicated life, didn't he? He grew up thinking his sister was his mum and his other way around, isn't it? His mum was his. Oh, I've forgotten that.
Okay.
He thought his gran, that's right, was his mum, and his mum was his sister. But anyway, no dad, and he was the same age, John Mayall, wasn't he, as those kind of jazzers. He was 3 years younger than Chris Barber.
Yeah,
that's astonishing.
Yeah.
Same age as Cyril Davis. So he was from that kind of jazz era. And also, he was very unusual in that he wasn't really the star. He wasn't, he was the band leader.
No, I don't. Just going back a stage to his national service, so he was stationed in Korea, which presumably when the war was going on in Korea, I suppose, it probably was. Yeah. And they used to go on leave to Tokyo. And it was in Tokyo that he got his first electric guitar. Because don't forget, this is a time when finding electric guitars is very, very difficult in the UK, because there's bans on imports, unnecessary luxury goods and so forth. And you certainly couldn't get anything from America. So he obviously got a kind of Japanese copy of an American guitar. And started playing the blues and started being a kind of band leader when he came back to Manchester. And he was at art college and was one of those people. This is I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to decline a call that's coming into my thing here. Sorry, carry on. He's one of those, that whole generation of young men and women of the time who went to local art colleges, because there were 1 million local art colleges in those days, to become a commercial artist. Do you remember that expression? Commercial. Nobody talks about it anymore, do they? They just meant they were designing letterheads or whatever was required by any.
Peter Blake started out the same way.
Yeah. Right, okay.
Letterheads, typography. In fact, I think Mayall actually designed some of his own sleeves.
He did. But I think encouraged by Alexis Corner, wasn't he? Alexis Corner was a slightly older godfather of the British blues. And it was Alexis Corner who encouraged him to come from Manchester down to London and made his first records with Decca. And
the other thing was he had a huge collection because his dad had been I think he was a blues guitarist in a band, wasn't he? So he grew up in that world like Pete Townsend did, with your dad's a local musician and you had a house full of records, etc. Yeah. And so his record collection, his library of blues records, must have been invaluable because you couldn't get a lot of those. He had a load of 78s, didn't he?
You simply couldn't get that stuff at all. So when he kind of hires the young Eric Clapton to be a member of his band. Well, Eric Clapton goes and lives at his house, And so Mayall's married and has got kids by then. So as far as Clapton is concerned, he's immensely kind of settled and got his life all sorted compared to the chaos of Eric Clapton's young life. But he's also got all these records. So if you want to listen to, I don't know, J.B. Lenoir or Otis Rush or whatever, here's a way that you could do it.
He wrote a song about.
because you literally couldn't hear that stuff. There was no way to hear it except from the small number of people. And it was, in Britain in those days, it might have been a dozen people scattered across the country who might have had that stuff, and he was one of the people who had it.
So Eric Clapton would sit there and listen to those records at night and work out the guitar arrangements and work out because he couldn't Google them. He could figure out and copy the solos and copy all the riffs.
The track that keeps getting played after his death, which is obviously the opening track of the 1966 album, John Mayall, Eric Clapton, Bluesbreakers, is All You Love, which is the
old Otis Rush song.
Otis Rush. And it's completely note for note. It's absolutely note for note of Otis Rush.
It is.
Version. Although it's fantastic at the same time, because actually Otis Rush's original version is wonderful. But you might say that the Eric Clapton, John Mayall version is slightly better recorded, actually. It kind of resounds more, you know what I mean?
Beautiful.
It really crackled that whole album, And that opening of All You Love is still one of the great things Eric Clapton played throughout his career, It still sends shivers up my spine when I hear it.
It's one of those rare occasions when I was listening to the Radio 4 the day he died and heard it announced at 5 o'clock in the morning. At 6 o'clock, it was on the Today programme. And the song they played to introduce this news item about his death was All You Love by Otis Rush. And it was one of those rare occasions when my absolute favourite John Mayall track was being used to
I did a thing on 5 Live and I thought, I bet they play something really inappropriate that came out in the last 10 years or something. But no, they played All You Love, which I
quite
thought,
right.
It kind of speaks for itself. So
we should go through some of the people, just briefly, the people in the band, because it is incredible, don't you think?
Go on.
So they are. There's Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker. There's then Huey.
Was
Flint,
Ginger Baker there? Jack Bruce was there. I don't know.
Yeah, Ginger Baker was in the band too.
Okay, right.
Yeah, yeah. Huey Flint went on to form McGuinness Flint. There's obviously John McVie and Mick Fleetwood, which I think is possible, and Peter Green. I think that may be where Mick Fleetwood and John McVie met.
Yeah,
Mick Taylor obviously went on the Stones. Aynsley Dunbar. With his Aynsley Dunbar's Retaliation, what a great band. And Frank Zappa. Eric Clapton, obviously. John, Mark and Johnny Armand, who I loved. They formed a band called Mark Armand.
Yes, funnily.
Weirdly. And they made that great record Turning Point with Mayall. Yeah. Then Jon Hiseman, who went on to form Colosseum. Then there was Larry Taylor, who was one of the founder members of Canned Heat.
And later on made all those records with Tom Waits, Larry Taylor, late in life, And wasn't Dick Hextall-Smith also briefly?
Yes, he was.
He was.
Yeah, Dick Hextall-Smith, that's right.
Because you have to remember, this was a time when, there was a certain kind of British rock blues musician who sort of wanted to behave like an American jazz musician. They wanted to move from group to group. They're no longer interested in being in groups called the Yardbirds or whatever. They wanted to be in the John Mayall band or the Jon Hiseman band or whatever, or the Georgie Fame band. And they would all just move from one to the other. And the thing that hadn't really gone into my head until this week, Bluesbreakers came out this week in 1966. And by the time it came out, it had been recorded in spring 1966. So it comes out in late July 1966. By the time it's out, Eric Clapton has left. He's left to start Cream. He's announced.
Oh, I think he had, because it was they played at the Reading Jazz and Blues Festival in 1966, didn't they? He was already a member.
And the first Cream single, Wrapping Paper, came out in 1966, surely.
Yeah.
Which gives you an idea of some kind of the speed at which people were working in those days. And now they look to the world. I've also got in front of me, Mark, I've got John Mayall and the Bluesbreakers dates for pretty much this week in 1966, and I'm going to go through them for you, okay? On the 14th, they were playing at the Stoke Hotel in Guildford. Do you know that? It's not far from your territory, is it?
Not far from where I was born.
And on the 15th, they were playing at the Ricky Tick in Hounslow. So that's following night, obviously. At the 16th, they're playing the Florida Rooms in Brighton. Sounds like a ballroom. On the 17th, at the Black Prince in London. Don't know where that was. Then on 22nd, at the Manor House, opposite Manor House Tube Station, not far from me. And then on the 23rd, at the Flamingo. On the 24th, at the Bromell Club, Bromley Court Hotel, Bromley, England. On the 25th, at the Marquee. On the 29th, at the California Ballroom, Dunstable. And then on the 30th, at the Bowes Lion House in Stevenage. Those are the kind of gigs they played. And they're probably, I'm guessing here, there wouldn't have been an awful lot of people at any of them. You know what I mean? No. They weren't kind of big stars or anything. There would be a following. There would just be the people who happened to go to the Manor House on a Wednesday night or whatever, or the Fishmonger's Arms in Wood Green. You know, all these gigs that, if you're of a certain age like me, whenever I go around London, I go on top of a bus, you know, I'm looking down and go, oh, that used to be the so-and-so, you know. I look at some pub and I think, well, that used to be Kluck's Cleek in, you know, just round the corner.
That's right. 10 years after once played in there.
Absolutely.
Oh, and Grandad, please.
Absolutely. And it's now a pub that's changed its name about 10 times since, you know. But also the other thing about those gigs is they're all kind of within reach of London. So they would have done the gig, they would have set up their own gear, they would have taken it all out at the end of the evening, put it in the back of a van, and then driven back home. Nobody stayed anywhere, you know what I mean?
No.
There might have been egg and chips on the way back or whatever. And there would have been, how much? 20 quid? Beer money? 20 quid would have been quite a lot of money in 1966, I suppose, you know. But it's an extraordinary, you know, work rate. And clearly John Mayall's great quality. And the reason he attracted all those musicians is, apart from the musical qualities, he could get organized. He could book the dates. You know, it was the John Mayall.
He did all the work for you. All you had to do was just turn up and sit in the van.
They absolutely turned up.
Collect your £2.22 and 6 or whatever.
And during that month that I've read out, Eric Clapton by then is kind of committed to Cream, and apparently he didn't turn up for a load of those gigs. So they would just turn up. There would have been John Mayall, you know, Huey Flint and John McVie. And then thinking,
as a trio.
There's a bloody great big hole
not singing very well. It's terrible to say this, really. He was a pretty poor quality singer, actually. And also, I can't remember a note he played, but that doesn't matter. That's
it doesn't matter. He was the leader.
And also, he was immensely cool. When that record came out in 1966, so I was, 12. And there was Eric Clapton reading the Beano on the cover. I remember being so confused by that because I'd only just given up childish things, you know. Not long before that, I'd been reading the Beano. There was Eric Clapton reading the Beano. It seemed so cool and so fabulous. Their clothes. And that was the same time as, I don't know, whatever it was, Revolver and things like that. It was just a totally different path. And then he went on to live in America. Immensely cool there. In fact, he was a very early adopter of Laurel Canyon. Laurel Canyon only really kind of came into the frame in 1970, 71. It was Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, the Mamas and the Papas. He was there in 1968. Trying very hard to look like he'd gone native. There's a picture on the front. It must have been on the back of Blues from Laurel Canyon, where he's lighting a fire, I think, and he's wearing what I can even describe as a sort of chamois leather pair of briefs, like a kind of caveman.
Oh yes, of course he is. I've forgotten that.
We used to laugh about that. So my sisters used to think it was the funniest thing I'd ever seen in their lives, you know. And, but then again, very cool, you know, there he was in his kind of, in his fringe suede jackets with his elastic sided, Cuban suede boots, you know.
But he was one of that generation of UK musicians who really had a fantasy of living the kind of Western life.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and you can see signs of this throughout that whole generation. You know, Bill Wyman. Why is he called Bill Wyman rather than Perks? Well, Wyman was a character in a cowboy film. Why is Ringo called Ringo Starr? You know, that whole generation, that's what they wanted. And of course, you mentioned his name in passing. The guy who was the drummer for John Mayall's band, and then got fired.
Keef Hartley.
Keef Hartley, spelled K-E-E-F. Hartley.
Didn't that conversation? What was the?
Well, okay. There's two things.
Yeah.
I think on the end of a John Mayall album, there's Keef Hartley apparently being fired, but at the beginning of Keef Hartley's Half Breed, in which it's the mother and father of cultural appropriation, because there he is. He comes from Preston, Lancashire, and he's wearing a kind of Sioux warrior's headdress, and
yes, he is.
His fantasy was that he was part Native American or Indian, as it would have been termed in those days. The opening track of Half Breed is John Mayall ringing up.
It's called Sacked, isn't it?
It's called Sacked. To say, I've got some bad news and whatever. It was tricked up for the record, whatever. But it was kind of, John Mayall hired and fired so frequently that it was a joke, you know what I mean, amongst musicians. It was kind of a badge of honor to have been fired by John Mayall. Mick Fleetwood was fired by John Mayall. Weren't we talking to Mark Blake about this the other day? Mark Blake has written a book about Fleetwood Mac. And Mick Fleetwood was fired from John Mayall at the age of about 16, wasn't it? Something like that. Thought it was all over,
And then rehired the next day or so because they couldn't get anybody else.
Something extraordinary like that. But yes, he did in Laurel Canyon. He wanted to live the Laurel Canyon life, so there was that. Yeah, it was Blues from Laurel Canyon. That's what it was called, wasn't it? And then there was another record round about the same time called Looking Back, where he's photographed on the cover, once again in his buckskin fringed jacket, where he's apparently hopping a freight, you know what I mean? And
that's right.
You just have to keep reminding yourself, he came from Macclesfield, you know what I mean?
That's right.
Like all these guys. Keef Hartley came from Preston in Lancashire.
Yeah,
but they all wanted to enter the great American romance. And of course, he lived in Laurel Canyon, as you say, until, probably the key event is 1979. There's a terrible fire in Laurel Canyon, isn't there?
Lots of properties destroyed, and his property is pretty much entirely erased, wasn't it? Which contained, two interesting things. One was an enormous collection of blues albums and all these 78s. I mean, that must have been an absolutely irreplaceable kind of world music legacy that was just melted down in the fire. And what was the other thing?
He had an extensive collection of pornography, which he is very well known for.
His porn collection, which dated back to the 1800s.
Well, there you go.
I don't know what what would that be? Early 19th century pornography was like, but John Mayall knew all about it anyway.
So it was a classic Laurel Canyon house, and it was built kind of on the side of the canyon, and it had a swimming pool, which musicians in their cups, or rather, overestimating their immortality, used to regularly dive from the balcony above directly.
The Brain Damage Club. Was it known as the Brain Damage Club?
Yeah.
People used to die. I know. Can you imagine it? Why there weren't more casualties? I've got no.
Well, I think he broke a leg. Actually, I think he broke a leg himself there. So that probably slowed him down a bit. But he pretty much lived in America for the rest of his life, didn't he?
He did, and he carried on doing stuff. I wasn't really aware of it, but he carried on working with all sorts of interesting people. But I've got a theory about John Mayall, and I'm sure this is absolute rubbish, Dave. But my theory is, if there'd been no John Mayall, let's just imagine there was no John Mayall, no John Mayall's Bluesbreakers, would there have been a Fleetwood Mac? If three members of Fleetwood Mac met during their time, I think, when they were in John Mayall's band, and if there'd been no Fleetwood Mac, then you think of all the groups that they influenced. When we interviewed Mark Blake actually the other day, he said that Status Quo completely changed their sound, didn't they? Because they'd done kind of pictures of Matchstick Men and all that, and they changed their sound to what they called a dinka 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 blues sound, based on Fleetwood Mac. So there were all the influence of Fleetwood Mac that's carried on for decades afterwards. There might have been no Cream. It's possible that all three members of Cream had also met during that time and been linked through John Mayall. So they may not have formed a group. And if there had been no Cream, then there wouldn't have been, I don't know, would there have been a Led Zeppelin or a Black Sabbath or all that kind of stuff? Would there have been any of the jam bands? If you listen to that first Grateful Dead record, Stop me if I'm boring you, but if you listen to that first Grateful Dead record, it's got covers of songs. They're just short tracks, like a version of Good Morning Little Schoolgirl. They're not huge improvisational jams.
No.
And the people who actually invented that were Cream, and that was then taken and extended by loads of other groups. So, you wonder if there hadn't been a John Mayall, would any of those things have happened? Would all those repercussions have resulted from it? I don't know.
No, I don't think they would. I think it's very difficult to explain him to the present, because it wasn't that he was a particularly extraordinary musician, but he was just an incredibly significant band leader. That's what he was,
Yeah.
So he related to the tradition of band leaders like, I don't know, jazz band leaders like Tommy Dorsey and those kind of people.
Yeah.
It was who passed through the ranks of what he did that mattered. And people went to see John Mayall in the certain knowledge that he would have a featured young star of some kind. Yeah. And it might be the next Eric Clapton. So following Eric Clapton, it was Peter Green. And then following Peter Green, it was Mick Taylor. And, it just continued. And when he went to the United States, it was, I don't know, Harvey Mandel. And then it was Sonny Landreth. He provided a showcase. He gave a load of people a place to stand, which they wouldn't have had without him. And, undoubtedly a very, very significant figure.
But that's really interesting point you made, because if I tried to explain who JohnMayall was to either of my kids, not I have to say they'd be remotely interested in an old blueser.
I'd like to watch that.
Start, because you've got no point of entry. They don't know what he looks like, even. No. They don't know what his character is like, because he wasn't particularly characterful. They can't think of anything he ever said in interviews. They wouldn't remember a note he sung or played. So all the usual touchstones. Because usually you can say something, well, you might remember this track from, there was a song that came out in 1967. It was a one-hit wonder, and he did so and so. There's none of that with John Mayall. In some sense, he's completely invisible, completely inaudible. As you say, it was just what he represented and the groups that he formed and the influence that he had. Very unusual.
The Word Podcast. Prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
Another person whose death was announced this week in his late 50s was Toumani Diabaté, the Malian kora genius, I think it's fair to say.
Absolutely.
Absolute master of the kora. And Mark is now going to explain for anybody who doesn't know what a kora is.
Well, kora is really unusual. It's made of a hollowed out gourd covered in cow skin. And it's got a kind of double bridge and two sets of strings. There's 11 strings played by the left hand and 10 strings played by the right hand simultaneously. So I suppose the nearest equivalent that's possible to imagine for a stringed instrument like that is the piano. And it's got three functions. You can play a bass line, which he did with his thumb. You play a melody line, and odd bits of chords with the fingers of the left hand, and you can also get involved in all sorts of improvisation. So it was a kind of combination of a lute and a harp, a double-bridged harp lute. Unbelievably complicated instrument, but capable of an enormous range of very complicated music. It's fantastic.
And I think, was it 2008 or 2006? I can't remember. I went to Mali to interview him and spent, a fair amount of time with him, and very often sat opposite him as he played. And you couldn't work out what he was doing at all. No. You just had to surrender to the sound.
But also the instrument faces you when you play it, which is unusual too. The opposite way around to a guitar.
And I had this unique experience with him that we were in Bamako, which is the capital of Mali. And clearly in Bamako, he was a man of some substance, so he had a house in a compound. But it wouldn't strike you as particularly luxurious by, UK standards or whatever, unmade roads, all that kind of thing, which his rather flash American car used to bounce up and down on these unmade roads going back and forth to his place. But it was decreed that I would interview him And I think there were two of us there. There was Robin Denslow, who was doing it for The Guardian, and there was me doing it for The Word. And he said, okay, just come and sit out in my yard with me. And this was in the evening. And of course, darkness descends in Africa far more abruptly than it descends in Europe. And so it wasn't long. He hadn't been talking long when we were sitting talking in absolute darkness. But he had his instrument in his lap. And as he talked, he played. And, you couldn't see anything apart from the glow of his cigarette. He used to, I can't remember which cigarettes they were. They were some sort of rather flash king-size brand. And he would get out another one and he would light it with a rather expensive, probably gold lighter. And that was the only light you saw. And then he would talk and you would hear this just fabulous kind of celestial sound. The kora is one of those instruments, its kind of nearest relation I can relate it to is the harp. You can't really play it loud. It can't be done. You know what I mean? You can't make a hurtful noise with the kora. Can't be done. It doesn't have that kind of edge. It's immensely gentle and very appealing in that respect. And he just sat there talking, playing in between, just improvising in between. I've no doubt got the recording somewhere, and I ought to dig it out and have a listen to it, because I think it's the only time I've ever interviewed anybody as they've played at the same time, while not being able to see him, because it was so dark in that yard, and there was no light coming from the house or anything of that nature. And I think the following night, so that was stuff he used to do on his own, because he was plugging a record called the Manday Variations, where he just recorded a load of improvisations in the Manday Hotel in Birmingham. And then he used to play on Saturday nights at a club with a full band of just fabulous Malian musicians who used to come along. And they played stuff like... he put out a record under the name of the Toumani Diabaté's Symmetric Orchestra, I think it's called. I can't remember the full name. It's a wonderful record where it's a kind of cross between his Malian traditional music and Earth, Wind and Fire or something like that. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's horns and singers and so forth. And there was just a fantastic show, and didn't come on until midnight. And of course, here's the gimmick about the club, Mark. We're all sitting in this club, waiting for him to come out there. And there's no roof on the club. There's no roof, because it's open to the African skies.
Incredible.
Because rain happens so rarely there, and so it's the only time I've ever been in the club in the open air. But just an absolutely extraordinary musician.
I can still remember your description of that and that piece in Word. It was fantastic. Brilliant.
And of course, he inherited playing the kora from his father, and his son, who I think I met, him must have been about 10 or something when I was there. Now carries on the same tradition, because that's the African way. Extraordinary man.
This is a junction in the Word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit.
I've been reading a lot in the news this last week about European tourist hotspots finally deciding that they've had quite enough visitors. Thank you very much. That cities like Barcelona are just utterly overwhelmed by people tramping the streets and all taking the same Instagram pictures of the same place. And I have to say, I'm very sympathetic to these cities, feeling that they've just kind of had enough of this. I told you my theory about school parties in London. This is the thing that I've been harboring for absolutely years, Mark. I go around the West End and I notice crocodiles of Spanish teenagers looking really bored out of their minds, being dragooned around, Tate Modern or the National Gallery or whatever. And the conclusion I reached about this applies to parties of teenagers. They're not remotely interested in anywhere they happen to be. They really don't have any interest at all. They're interested in two things: their phones and each other. Yes. So what we should do is divert school parties away from cities that have got too much tourism and direct them to places that haven't got sufficient. Okay. So in future, school parties should go to Peterborough or Doncaster or Falkirk or whatever, you know what I mean? Where there'll be an enormous boon for the local economy, because they need tourism, and they won't be overcrowding the tourist hotspots. That's one of my theories.
But and how are you going to tempt them? They're going to say, we're going to get to Peterborough so that you can all sit on a park bench, look at your phones, and talk to each other. That's great. We'll do that.
Basically it.
We're not going to see the original site of the Battle of Preston Pans. Or whatever
no, absolutely. Exactly. But anyway, in the vein of people trying to divert tourism from places that are oversubscribed, I was thinking about, you could apply the same thing with music-related sites, So if you want to have your picture taken on the zebra outside Abbey Road, you have to join a queue, don't you? Because there's thousands of people looking to do it.
It's like going to the top of Everest.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there are many other parts of, the UK generally, but I was thinking particularly in London, where there's quite significant rock history. And I'm going to nominate one, Mark, because it's not far from where I live, which is Fortis Green Road in Muswell Hill. Because there's two within the length of Fortis Green Road, which is not that far. It kind of joins Muswell Hill with East Finchley. So you could go East Finchley Tube and you could walk there. East Finchley Tube, very nice tube station, actually. Walk past the oldest working cinema in Britain, actually, onto Fortis Green Road. And there you will find what was formerly the home of Ray and Dave Davis of the Kinks. So all Ray Davis's kind of fantasies, Muswell Hillbillies, all that kind of stuff, all comes from Fortis Green Road. That's the house next to the pub where they used to live. I'm not sure if it's got a blue plaque on it. I don't, it might do. And then if you go slightly further down the road, you come upon a house called Fairport, which sits on the corner of a very nice suburban avenue. And of course, that is the house that gave its name to the Great Fairport Convention, because that's where Simon Nicholls' father was a doctor, and they used to go and rehearse in the house. And when they wanted the name for the group, it called Fairport.
Go and convene,
and it's still got the same sign saying Fairport outside it. And I think it changed hands recently, this house, for
a huge sum of money. We were following that,
yeah. So that's just one case of a nice little suburban street in London that has more than one, interesting musical association. And there are these places all over London. Go on, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say just about 400 yards from where I live is Chiswick House grounds, where the Beatles made, on the 20th of May, 1966, they made the videos with Michael Lindsay Hogg for Paperback Writer and Rain. Fantastic. There's just only 2 years ago did they have a little special place in Chiswick House where there are old pictures of it and all that and celebrate it. It's an amazing thing. It's really, really historic and revolutionary videos. It was the nearest kind of big garden that they could get near the centre of London. They could get out and shoot this thing. And there's some great pictures of them wandering around it with Tony Barrow and Neil Aspinall and Brian Epstein and stuff. And it's so there's that, and there's the tree that they sat in. There's for the there's them standing in front of the urns and the sphinxes playing. There's them in the old conservatory with the wisteria tree. It's terrific. McCartney with his chipped tooth and his fat lip because the day before he'd fallen off a moped.
Yes,
and if you wanted to, nearby, obviously, just down the road is Olympic Studios where Led Zeppelin, The Who, and the Stones recorded. You can go to Shepherd's Bush. There are tons of Who landmarks there. The old Eel Pie and Mash shop that they went to. And there's the Mark Bolan tree, I suppose.
Of course, Barnes Common,
in Barnes Common, where on the 16th of September it was, wasn't it? The car with him Gloria Jones crashed and where he died. And every 16th of September, that tree is always kind of decorated with little poems and flowers and people sitting there in a ring of candles. So all that's just my little area.
So rock history is not just in the obvious well-trodden places. It's more rewarding to go to the places that are less obvious and relieve pressure on local services and hard-pressed locals. That's our advice to you. So what else have we got? This is Any Other Business. We should just remind people that if they haven't already done so, we will very much appreciate people becoming Patreon supporters. And if you're a Patreon supporter, you get early and uninterrupted access to absolutely everything we do in video when it's appropriate, in sound when it's otherwise. You get it first. You get to know about it. You get priority access and booking in events we do and so forth. And also you get that warm glow from knowing that we are always thinking about you. We're always wondering what you're doing right this moment, because we have a very special relationship with those people who've signed on as Patreon supporters. Indeed, to such an extent that on the occasion of their birthday, we invite them occasionally to join us, don't we, Mark?
We do, and we have somebody this week we're about to talk to, which is our birthday guest, Gianluca Tramontana. So bring him on.
The Word Podcast. Fix yourself a drink and it's like being in the pub.
And we're joined by a birthday guest. Very nice to see you, Gianluca Tramontana. Very nice to see you.
Oh,
and happy birthday.
You. Oh, thank you, Mark. Yeah, thank you. It's good to be seen.
Very good. And you're in New York, right?
I'm in New York right this minute, yes. Back in England soon. Oh, back in Europe soon. Back in Italy soon. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Not at all. You've got a conversational log you want to chuck on the fire.
There is.
In the hat.
There is actually. It's sort of in defense of dance is the final point. But they found instruments that are thousands of years old. So music was a fundamental. It suggests that music was sort of a fundamental human necessity, including dance was a fundamental human necessity. So if you fast forward that, then it becomes art at a certain point. Now music is, if you go and see a gig, it's really like seeing theater. So at some point it became art. And then at some point, probably in the 60s, I'm guessing, sort of rock law, LORE, developed. And then rock law, LAW, developed. There's sort of a rule book came out of this thing. And I got my thought.
And what were those rules?
Well, my thought process started with one of your podcasts, actually. Oh, this is also your fault. Because years ago, I think it was Andrew Harrison, and you were talking about Phil Collins and about whether he should be let back in. And one of you said that there seems to be a rule book of good things in rock and bad things. Phil Collins, bad. Kajagoogoo, bad. Thompson Twins, bad. Good. Captain Beefheart. Best drummer, John Bonham, Ringo Starr. Best guitar player, Jimi Hendrix, Jeff Beck. These are the rules.
Wasn't a lot of that to do with the rock press, which is no longer really there? Wasn't that a rock press agenda that was commercial?
Probably. And I think we all fell for it, or I certainly did, actually. I'm doing this really as a confessional and making amends because...
But also, when you get older, it's also with getting older that you look back at the records that, I've got up in the attic. I've got, I've found some Cabaret Voltaire, Blurt and Swell Maps records. I haven't played those for years, because you don't want to. You're just older and you just don't want anything that challenging. So all the things that were laughed at are actually perfectly acceptable. A lot of them.
Oh, absolutely. I have my first ever cassette tape that I recorded off the radio when I was 12, and it's got really cool things like Ian Dury, Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick, and it also has Shawaddy Waddy. on it as well. So, and that's just the mind of a 12-year-old that loves all these amazing sounds and doesn't really have any sort of reason to dislike anything.
I suppose, the golden rule really, and this is the conclusion I've reached after God knows how many years listening to records and reading about them and so forth, is the more seriously people take their musical tastes, the more you should disregard them, basically.
Yes.
Because music, when Mark has always said this, is that, and you notice this whenever a kind of new politician comes along and nowadays they have to publish the list of their favorite records, what's on my iPad or whatever. And Mark always says that they're not doing this to tell you anything about what they like. What they're doing is positioning themselves. They're making it clear that they are this kind of person. And that's one of the things that when people advertise their musical taste, that's what they're doing. It's nothing to do with music at all. It's all to do with them. I like Nick Cave, therefore I'm a serious person. I like this or that thing that's happened this week, therefore I am an edgy, up-to-the-minute person, whatever. It's not genuine at all. And the more they've thought about it, the less genuine it is. And it isn't just music, is the other thing that struck me. Because, when people think about the great television programs that they watched or whatever, they're going to say, I don't know, The Wire, or they're going to say Edge of Darkness. They're not going to say Friends or The Morecambe or Wise Show or whatever, because we have this terrible cultural snobbery that we regard anything that appears to be having a light effect to be easy. Well, it's not. It fundamentally is not. But that's what we like to think. We like to think that the more serious, more furrowed-browed the individual creating the art is, the more serious the art will be.
Which is exactly the same in films, isn't it? Why do comedies never win an Oscar? Because people think comedy is superficial. It's far harder to make a great comedy than it is to make the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah, it's harder to write a pop song too, arguably.
It is. Well,
success of a commercial one. Yes, it is.
Of course it is.
Also, I think there's another point about that, about dance music, which I think that's been reversed, actually.
Now it has.
I think it's been reversed. I think a lot of the people that were derided, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, Phil Collins and ELO and ABBA and the Eagles and Hall & Oates things are now really, really fashionable. And also EDM, electronic dance music, has effectively won. Disco, that whole thing about, disco being terrible. Disco is now absolutely revered. So it's kind of partly dance music's world,
There was a sort of a 30 or 40 year lost generation whereby, culture seems to value suffering over joy and fun.
Yeah.
And you had Alan Lomax positioning blues, which is actually happy, joyful dance music.
Well, it's a classic. Alan Lomax is the classic case that, when he discovered Leadbelly, he wanted Leadbelly to go on stage in his prison stripes.
And Leadbelly said, I'm a song and dance man. And Leadbelly played... swing, didn't he? He played. He made.
He was a busker.
Dance music, anything. He just plug him in at a party.
Blind Willie McTell used to sing "You Are My Sunshine" because everybody sang "You Are My Sunshine." Because nobody's interested in it. There's really interesting recordings of Alan Lomax talking to Blind Willie McTell in a hotel room in Atlanta, Georgia. In the 30s, must be the late 30s.
Oh, yes.
And it's a fascinating thing to listen to. You can find it on Spotify, I think, or anywhere. Because in between, Blind Willie plays his tunes. And Lomax keeps butting in and said, have you got any suffering songs?
He's got complaint songs.
Have you got complaining songs? That's what he says.
Yeah.
He says, haven't you got any songs about how the white people mistreat the Negro? All that. Yeah. And Blind Willie McTell, partly out of genuine response, partly because he's being diplomatic, says, well, no, I haven't got anything like that.
No, I can make one up for you on the spot.
And the other thing he does, Blind Willie McTell, on that recording is in between his occasional suffering songs, he sings a song about Edward VIII and Mrs. Simpson.
Oh,
about how he married for love and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But our image of blind Willie McTell is this dark figure.
Yeah.
Somewhere, it's like our image of Robert Johnson still comes from that painting on the cover of King of the Delta Blues Singers. That's what we prefer to think because it works for us. It wasn't like that at all. So I think in any form of art, likeness is the hardest thing of all.
Absolutely.
Because you've got to stop.
I agree. There's actually funny you mentioning about Lomax and Leadbelly. There's a big Bill Brunsey live in maybe it's Copenhagen in the early 60s. And he's singing things like Glory of Love and I Get the Blues When It Rains and stuff, which is probably what the type of thing Robert Johnson was singing. He was getting people to dance and have a good time.
You see, it's the dancing thing that we can't get our heads around. You read about this. Johnson played in juke joints for people who were dancing. And you think, how the bloody hell did that work? We can't imagine. Because we can't imagine dance without a pronounced, 4/4 or whatever. It just how did people dance to it? Fascinating, but it wasn't just, it couldn't be an evening of kind of uninterrupted misery because people wouldn't have signed up for it, would they?
I think that's one of the reasons that Bob Dylan always advertised himself as a song and dance act.
Yes.
Because he wants to be associated with that kind of tradition. Yes. And also he's sending up the idea that everybody wants to get there and just stroke their chins and try and work out what are the gates of Eden,
Absolutely.
So I'm with him on that.
Bob Dylan is the ultimate life of Brian, where he told us at the very beginning, I'm a song and dance man. I'm not a prophet. Leave me alone.
Yeah, exactly.
I still think he's a genius. But
very good.
I want to play my music.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, he's done all right out of it.
He's done all right.
It still goes on. Well, look, thanks very much for raising that topic. I think it was worth getting that ventilated. And if you didn't do it, I don't know who would have done.
Well, can I get one more thing off my chest?
Go on.
Just because blues we were talking about, and the blues had a baby, they called it rock and roll. And rock and roll doesn't mean sausage roll. Roll means dancing, right? Because all rock and roll bands were dance bands, including the Stones and the Beatles.
Absolutely, definitely.
Well, rock and roll was a euphemism, wasn't it? As was funk and various other things,
But it was the fact that in the 1960s, you could not have a party without a Rolling Stones record. You simply couldn't. Yeah. It didn't exist.
Didn't start to Brown Sugar came on.
Yeah, nowadays it's a different thing. People are kind of looking for a different thing. The world's moved on, I suppose. Well, look, thanks very much. And
lovely to see you.
Happy birthday.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.